أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا ومولانا محمد صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه ومن اهتدى بهداه إلى يوم الدين فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي ربي لا تؤاخذني مما يقولون واغفر لي ما لا يعلمون واجعلني خيرا مما يظنون أما بعد. My dear brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Welcome one more time to the House of Dua, the channel from which you learn about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, about His creation, about His message, about His messenger, and of course, about His chosen religion known as Al-Islam. My dear brothers, my dear sisters, how much do you know about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? About your relationship with Him, about the mission He has assigned to you for bringing you to this planet. How much do you know about His commandments, as well as His prohibitions upon you? How much do you know about His love for you and His distaste to some of your actions from which He wants you to stay away so that His love for you will always be a thing that you enjoy? How much do you know about the entire creation of Allah, the signs He manifests to you from time to time, which are designed to guide you to the right way? How much do you know about the messenger that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent to you? And of course, the message Al-Quran al-Kareem. How much do you know about it? How much do you know about the life example of the Prophet, which are documented in what is known as the Hadith of the Prophet sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam? And how much do you know about the right way to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? There are so many forms of acts of worship in the world we live, many of which claim that they are on the right way. How do you know which is in the right way? My dear brothers, my dear sisters, this is what the House of Dua is all about, dedicated to letting you know about your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A channel that tells you what you ought to know about your Creator, your Sustainer, your Provider, your Curer, your Cherisher and Nourisher, the one who is in control of your life, the one to whom you shall return for accountability after your stay on this planet. This is the channel from which you learn about the creation of Allah, about the message Allah has sent to us, and about the messenger through whom that message was sent, and of course, about the right way to reach out to that your Creator, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the channel from which you can learn all this, thereby making you a good Muslim. And if you know all this, then of course you enhance your chance of success in the world we live. And of course, your chance of success will become higher when you meet Allah on the day of accountability. This is what we take joy in doing, bringing to you messages from the Quran that will be of benefit to you, and messages from the Hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam. And we advise you to check your phone every day to see what the House of Dua is bringing to you. The House of Dua is bringing to you verses and verses from the Quran that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed, drawing your attention as believers to that which you should do or should not do. And if you must do them also, how to do them by following the example of the Messenger Muhammad sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam. Today we are continuing this presentation by bringing you some verses from the Quran relating to discharging the obligations that you enter into. My dear brothers, my dear sisters, there are two ways we carry out our action in the life we live. There are certain actions we carry out instantly and accomplish them, and they are gone. For example, the salah is due, and you observe the salat at the right time. It's gone. But there are other actions that we have to defer to a later date. For example, salah is due as well. You are on a journey, or you are in a situation in which that salah cannot be observed by you as a result of the limitations lawful limitations upon you at that time. And then you tell yourself, I will render my salat later. That is an action deferred to the future. We are not encouraged to defer our salat if there is no genuine reason. Our focus today is actions that we defer to the future. And sometimes we defer these actions by reducing them to either promises or agreements or vows, or we sign treaties between nations, for example, either bilateral or multilateral, or we have a community agreement, or we have an agreement with our family members, like an agreement between a husband and a wife. If a husband, for example, promises a wife, I will take you to Makkah if you marry me. Now the wife has married you, she wants you to fulfill your obligation. My dear brothers, my dear sisters, a lot of actions that we find ourselves carrying out are known as deferred actions. We postpone them to the future. When we are not even the owner of the future, we don't know whether we'll be able to meet them. But do you know that such actions are obligatory upon you? Any action you defer to the future for a reason, especially when you come into an agreement with somebody, it's upon you to discharge that agreement. Sometimes we call it trust. Amana. Amana is a very huge subject in Islam. We are expected to discharge our amana, that is the trust people repose in us. As simple as making a promise to attend a meeting. It's important for you to attend that meeting. Or making a promise with a person to meet at a particular point. It's obligatory upon you to fulfill that promise. If you know you cannot fulfill it, then you let the person know ahead of time so that he doesn't come around and waste his or her time. My dear brothers, my dear sisters, we are drawing our attention to this today because many of us just find ourselves struggling in life and we don't know why we are struggling. Many of us are in possession of enormous resources and yet happiness is very far away. We get stressed out unnecessarily. But little things add up and they matter a lot in Islam. What we consider to be mere trifle can be a big deal in the sight of Allah. Something like a promise. Something like an agreement. Let's come back to those of us who live in the Western world, where buying today and paying later is a common thing. We call it credit. You don't have enough money to buy a car or buy a home or buy a television at the same time, but you go into agreement and say, you know what, give it to me and I will pay later. Then an agreement is worked out for you to pay either in 30 years or 100 years or 5 years, as the case may be. It does not matter whether that agreement is between you and a non-believer. It's obligatory upon you to discharge that agreement. In today's life, especially in the Western world, those who have failed in that regard have found themselves miserable. What about when we come to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala later on? My dear brothers, my dear sisters, this is a very big deal in Islam. And that's why we are drawing our attention to it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will want us to discharge our obligations. He will want us to discharge our promises. He will want us to discharge our vows if we make them. They are known as obligations. And it's important for you to discharge the obligations. We have obligation towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We signed an agreement with him before we came here. Under that agreement, he asked us a question. Am I not your Lord? You are going to the planet to worship. And we reply, we agreed, Ya Allah. We are going to worship you when we get there. Then he told us how to worship him. That's the primary reason why he brought us here. I have not created man and jinn for any other purpose except to worship him. Now we come here. Are you worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as you ought to be worshipped? Are you fulfilling that agreement? There is also what we call hukukul walidain. That is the rights and obligations you owe to your parents. We also have the duties we owe to one another. Hakum Muslim alan Muslim. These are all terms that relate to the relationship we have and how to keep those relationships in good condition by discharging the obligations we owe to one another. But many of us nowadays go into obligations either by mouth or in writing, and they turn their back against those obligations. They think they are smart. No, yestafuna mina nas wala yestafuna mina la. But who am I kunzo by tuna mala iradomina cow? You can only deceive men, you cannot deceive Allah, because Allah is there when you were doing whatever you did. Whatever you utter out of the mouth, He is aware. He will hold you to account. My dear brothers, my dear sister, let's save ourselves from unnecessary, challenges in life. Many of us are just struggling, even though we have the means to live good life. But we are struggling because those things we consider to be trifles, they are in fact a big deal in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is an agreement that you go into with a human being, a fellow human being, especially a promise made by a husband to a wife or a wife to a husband. These are binding. What about the promise we as a nation make with another nation, known as bilateral agreements that nations sign among themselves? What are the treaties of non-aggression we sign between ourselves as nations, either multilateral or bilateral treaties? How well do we execute these treaties to the letter? Sometimes failure to uphold a treaty between nations can lead to war. Aren't you aware of that? So this is a thing that happens at individual level and also happens at macro level between nations and between organizations. And it's also very common nowadays in business relations. My dear brothers, my dear sisters, discharging obligations is an issue that all of us need to take seriously. Because whatever action you take or fail to take has a consequence upon you in this dunya as well as in the akhirah when you meet Allah on the day of accountability. This is why we are bringing you verse 1 of Surah Al-Ma'idah today, supported with other verses that are relevant to it in the Quran. In verse 1 of Surah Al-Ma'idah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala declares, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu awfu bil uqudi uhillat lakum bahimatul an'am illa ma yutla alaykum ghayra muhlis saydin wa antum hurum inna Allaha yahkumu ma yuridu. Oh, you have believed, discharge your obligations. Lawful to you are the meat products from animals like cattle, sheep, goat, such livestock. They are lawful to you as meat. So also meat that you procure through hunting, as long as you are not wearing ihram. For those of you who perform the Hajj, it's not allowed to wear ihram and go about hunting or even killing little insects or flies that fly around unless they pose a danger to you. Otherwise, you are not allowed to kill such living objects while you are wearing ihram performing the Hajj. My dear brothers, my dear sisters, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, we have listed for you animals whose meat products are prohibited to eat. Other than that, the meat products of cattle and other animals related are lawful to you to eat. Why was this verse revealed, my dear brothers, my dear sisters? The Prophet sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam was virtually driven out of Makkah and sought refuge in Medina in what is known as Hijrah. And finally, he came back to Makkah, victorious over the people of Makkah. Remember that even before the Prophet became a prophet, the people of Makkah were always engaged in internecine wars, intertribal wars against one another. And in some cases, they signed an agreement of non-aggression. And when the Prophet came into life, similar agreements were signed between him and the Mushrikun of Makkah and the Munafiqun of Medina and the Jews of Medina. So when victory finally came to the Prophet, some people were saying that such agreements should not be honored. Yeah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought this verse. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu awfu bil uqud. Oh, you have believed, fulfill your obligations. According to Ibn Mas'ud, radiallahu anhu, the Prophet sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam say, whenever you hear this statement, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, oh, you have believed, pay attention. Pay attention, because Allah is not calling you for nothing. He's calling you to lay a ground rule for you. He's calling you to lead you through a way that will make you happy. Either to establish a commandment for you to obey, or to establish a commandment on a thing that he needs you to stay away from in order for you to be happy. Therefore, whenever you hear Yahayo Alezina Amanu, pay attention, because an important matter is being discussed. The important matter in this case is the issue of fulfilling your obligation. How many obligations do we enter into between us and our employers, between us and our other individuals, between us and our family members, between us and the government, between us and our community leaders? How many of such obligations do you have pending on your neck now that you have not discharged? Go and discharge them before you start harming yourself and you are blaming somebody else. My dear brothers, my dear sisters, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us perfect example of situations in the past from which we can learn lessons about what it means to discharge obligations and what it means to refuse to discharge obligation, the consequence of it. First of all, let's go to Surah An-Nisa, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam, Inna Allaha ya'murukum an tu'addul amanati ila ahliha wa iza hakamtum bayna nas an tahkumu bil adli inna Allaha ni'ma ya'izukum bi inna Allaha kana sami'an basira. Allah has commanded upon you all to discharge the obligation you owe to people. This is a good admonition from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The benefit of it is immeasurable. Allah is all hearing and all seeing. Therefore, discharge the obligation you owe to people. This ayah was revealed when the Prophet came to Makkah. Some people say it was during Fatih Makkah or before then. And he wanted to enter the Kaaba. A man who was a disbeliever took the key to the Kaaba and ran away so that the Prophet would not have access to the Kaaba. His name was Uthman bin Taha. And the Prophet sent Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu to fetch the key. And Sayyidina Ali went there and grabbed the key from Uthman bin Taha and brought it to the messenger. Sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam. He used the masjid and came out. But his uncle Al-Abbas radiallahu anhu told the Prophet, it's even better for us to keep this key, not to give it back to those to whom it was pledged earlier, prior to the time the Prophet became a messenger. Because the people of Makkah, they shared responsibility on how to manage the Kaaba. So the key was assigned to a specific family, the family of Uthman bin Taha. It's not radiallahu anhu because he finally accepted Islam and became a Sahabi of the Prophet. But at that time, he was not a Sahabi. So when Al-Abbas radiallahu anhu suggested this, the Prophet was considering it. Then Allah brought this verse. Allah has commanded you to discharge the obligation that is due to those to whom the obligation was due. In this case, the key that belonged to the family of Uthman bin Taha returned the key to them. My dear brother, my dear sister, the issue of amana is very serious in Islam. Indeed, it's very serious. Now let's take an example of a man who broke amana. In Surah At-Tawbah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us the story of Thalaba ibn Hatib al-Ansari. He was a bit of moderate income, but he needed to be rich. So he asked the Prophet sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam to pray for him to be rich. The Prophet told him, look, to be too rich is a problem. It will divert you away from the way of Allah. I said, no, I will use my income to help the cause of Allah. So the Prophet prayed to Allah, Allahumma ati Thalaba mu'ala. Oh Allah, grant Thalaba plenty of wealth. And he became rich. Thalaba that used to come to the masjid was no longer coming to the masjid. He was only coming to the masjid on Friday. Thereafter, he abandoned Friday Jumu'ah service. One day the Prophet said, where is Thalaba? They said he had become so rich that he would not fulfill his obligation. But Thalaba had made a promise to Allah that if he were given some wealth, he would use it to help the cause of Allah. وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ أَعَهَدَ اللَّهَ لَيَأْتَانَا مِنْ فَضْلِهِ لَنَصَدَّقَنَّ وَلَنَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الصَّالِحِينَ. He promised Allah, if I'm given wealth, I will discharge my obligation by helping the cause of Allah. But when the wealth came, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala followed it up with the law on zakah, you know, rich people don't want to give up their money. So Thalaba refused to pay zakah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not take kindly to that. He told the Prophet not to accept zakah from Thalaba. because Talaba was hesitating to pay the zakat. And that's what Allah says, as a result of the behavior of Talaba being Hatib al-Ansari, we allow nifaq, hypocrisy, to dwell in his heart until the day of accountability when he will face his problem. Even from dunya here, he faced enormous problem before he passed away. My dear brothers, my dear sisters, let's not play with the obligations we have undertaken to execute. As I said, there are actions we can carry out right now and accomplish them right away, and they are gone. But there are actions we defer to the future based on promise or based on agreement that we write with people. It's important that we discharge such obligations. In Surah Al-Mu'minun and Surah Al-Ma'arij, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala extols the virtues of those who discharge their obligations. He promised great reward for them. In Surah Al-Mu'minun, for example, Allah says, Qad aflaha al-mu'minun. Successful are those who are believers. And one of the characteristics of those who are believers mentioned in this verse are those those, when they are given trust, they discharge their trust honestly. And those, when they make their promise, they fulfill their promise honestly as well. But on the other hand, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala condemns the attitude of those who fail to discharge their obligations. In Surah Al-Baqarah and Surah Al-Rad, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, الَّذِينَ يَنقُضُونَ عَهْدَ اللَّهِ مِن بَعْدِ مِيثَاقِهِ وَيَقْطَعُونَ مَا أَمَرَ اللَّهُ بِهِ أَن يُوصَلَ وَيُفْسِدُونَ فِي الْأَرْضِ أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْخَاسِرُونَ. Those who break their agreement and who tear apart what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says should be joined together, those are going to be people who will be losers on the day of accountability. And in Surah Ar-Rad, it says something similar. الَّذِينَ يَنقُضُونَ عَهْدَ اللَّهِ مِن بَعْدِ مِيثَاقِهِ وَيَقْطَعُونَ مَا أَمَرَ اللَّهُ بِهِ أَن يُوصَلَ وَيُفْسِدُونَ فِي الْأَرْضِ أُولَٰئِكَ لَهُمُ اللَّعْنَةُ وَلَهُمْ سُوءُ الدَّارِ. Those who break their agreements and tear apart what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded to be joined together and continue to spread corruption on this planet, upon such people is the curse of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the end of such people is woeful. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala save us from that. Every day we are praying to Allah to grant us a good end. But here is something that will turn your good end into a disaster. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to save us from that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Saf asks a question. Ya ayyuhallazina amanu lima taquluna ma la taf'alun. Kabura makatan inda Allahi an taqulu ma la taf'alun. Oh, you who have believed, why do you say that which you will not do? Why do you make a promise you will not keep? Kabura makatan inda Allah is a big hateful conduct in the sight of Allah for you to make a promise that you will not keep or say something that you will not carry out. My dear brothers and dear sisters, it cannot be less than that. Therefore, let's take our obligation seriously. The Prophet sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam, in the hadith narrated by Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, says, Adil amanata ila manita manaka, wala takun ila man khanaka. Discharge the obligation you hold to people. Do not use treachery to pay back treachery. In other words, it doesn't matter whether the person was treacherous. You fulfill your own side of the obligation and leave that person to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. My dear brothers, my dear sisters, let's try as much as possible to do that which is right so that our life in this world will be easy and our return back to Allah will be better. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا يا مولانا إنك أنت الغفور الكريم سبحان الله وبحمده سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك الحمد لله.